Hello, everyone. Welcome to Freedom is the Cure, where we aim to show that whatever the societal ailment, freedom is always the cure. I'm Paul Dragu, the Communications Director for the John Birch Society. Thanks for tuning in. So what do China, North Korea, Russia, and Cuba have in common? Yes, they're totalitarian states, but they also happen to be countries that have only state-controlled policing forces. And that's not a coincidence. Competent tyrants know that a monopoly on force is necessary to keep the cattle in line. In Germany, before Adolf Hitler came to power, individual German states controlled the police forces within their borders. After Hitler became chancellor, however, he and his Nazi henchmen began centralizing control of all German police forces. And once the Third Reich had a monopoly on force, the Nazis' march of terror went relatively unchallenged inside one of the most sophisticated nations in the world. Before inflicting carnage all over Europe, the Nazi machine ended up committing evil atrocities to its own citizens. In the United States, we have local police, relatively free of federal control. The officers and the deputies tend to live in the same communities they police. They tend to have their pulse on the community. They often know the people. And their chiefs and sheriffs are either elected or appointed by someone who is elected. Either way, local police are part of the local community, made up of citizens who can hold their officers and deputies accountable. With the horrific beating and eventual death of Tyre Nichols in Memphis by what seems to be a group of deranged individuals with badges and guns, talk of policing is once again at the national forefront. And no doubt, the left will exploit this to further one of their longtime goals, and that's seizing police control away from local communities and transferring it to the deeply entrenched and corrupt swamp in Washington. In this episode, we're discussing why local police is necessary to a free society and why nationalization of all police is a staple of tyranny. But before we dive in, please remember to follow our social media and podcast channels and like and share this episode. Like with most truth tellers, big tech restricts our message heavily, and we could use your help to help spread our message. So I'm joined today by former CEO of the John Birch Society, Art Thompson, and Law Enforcement Charitable Foundation Director, Matt Harper. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So, Matt, I want to ask you first, as a former police officer, what did you think when you saw some of the footage of those officers or former officers down in Memphis in that incident with Tyre Nichols?
Well, first and foremost, thoughts and prayers to the Nichols family. I think the first thing I thought, and a lot of officers I've talked to thought, was just like a big sigh of, oh, because it's one of these things where every day you're working to work with the community, build that trust, build that relationship, and really foster and let them know all the good things that are happening. And then when something like this happens, it paints a negative picture on all law enforcement. And obviously that's not the case. Not all law enforcement is behaves that way, but that's kind of what gets lumped together. So it was just a kind of another one of those, okay, we need to really focus on what we can do to make sure people know that law enforcement officers are trying to do the best out there, and this doesn't mean the acts of a few don't count for everybody.
Yeah, we're going to get into that because Jason Riley had an op-ed, I believe, yesterday or this morning in the Wall Street Journal where he cited some studies that show that violence, and especially police-related shootings and things like that, they declined tremendously over the 50 to 60 years. And so the narrative, of course, that we're hearing is not that. And, of course, I'd imagine that law enforcement families, the community as a whole, every time something like this happens, there is a misperception or at least a misconstrue the law enforcement community. Art, you probably already know this, but in 1963, here at the John Birch Society, we started the Support Your Local Police and Keep Them Independent campaign. And it's been one of I think it's our second longest running one. The first one was Get Us Out, correct?
That's correct.
And there was a lot going on back in the 60s that seemed similar, including I believe there was a 1961 committee hearing, a congressional committee hearing that divulged that the communists were using strategies that seemed to be very similar to what Black Lives Matter started doing during the riots in 2020. Over time, what do you think are the similarities and differences of the way that this attack on law enforcement and the perception of law enforcement in regards to culture?
Well, the differences between the two are very, very minimal. They're so similar that you can probably say they're the same. There are some tweaks here and there, but generally speaking, it's the same because it's the same force behind the anti-police movement. And quite frankly, in a word, what's behind it is communism. Now, to that, a lot of people say, well, that's the old bugaboo and all that stuff. But if you study it, including that report, which you just cited, it shows and cites that it was the communists behind the anti-police movement. And they've always been behind it. And the Defund the Police, the BLM, Antifa, all of these outfits today are Marxist organizations, trained Marxists.
Right. As Patrice Cullors of Black Lives Matter admitted in front of a camera.
They've all admitted that they've been trained.
Yeah, and it's the same tactics. I was going to ask you, like, who is behind the anti-police movement? And I think you're right in the sense that it's like, oh, communism, whatnot. And some would say, well, it's a form of statism. They've kind of molded together, or they've bastardized all the statist organizations and efforts. But it seems to be the same goal, and is that to nationalize police?
Yes, it is. And there's actually a false solution involved in this too, by the way, if I can interject that. Because one side, the Marxists, the openly Marxists, say that we need to defund the police or get rid of them, have the federal government come in. Usually hidden within that agenda, though, is that's the first step. The second step is then the United Nations. But on the other side, the people who want law and order, that want more police and all of that, they have a similar program that reaches the same goal, only in a longer period of time. In other words, the left wants federalism right now. The right wants to fund the local police departments with equipment, hiring, police reform on a national scale and all that stuff, which leads to federal control in the long run, because the federal government will always control what it finances. So one's the short way and one's the long way, but both of them are wrong. So the way the John Birch Society advocates is to keep our police departments independent, under local control by the city councils. And it can be funded locally. A lot of things that the city councils put in their budget are not necessary.
You've served on the city council, right?
I've served on my city council. I've also served as the head of Support Your Local Police Committees.
Yeah.
And the thing is that the police want to do a good job. I mean, they are servants of the community, and they feel that way.
Yeah.
And it must just be heart-wrenching to them to see what's going on in the way in the media and other attacks against them, when they're just trying to do a good job.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Matt, would you say that there are some who are not? So, I mean, there's obviously, like with everything else, there's some bad apples out there. What would we say to those who are like, clearly there still is. There's some bad apples. There's corruption. We know that there's in New York City, I believe, it used to have a massive problem, and it's renowned for its corruption, and obviously it can't be the only one. So what do we say to those folks? Because that's going to be exploited too, I imagine. They're like, oh, there's corruption, so we need transparency, we need police review boards and whatnot. What do we say to folks who say, okay, well, what do we do about the corruption and everything that's happening within police forces?
I think the first step is we have to acknowledge it. I mean, it is out there, but again, it's that small percentage. And then we need to really focus on what we can do to work together to bring those things to light, and then hold those individuals accountable. I think that's the big thing that we're seeing in law enforcement is there's been a lot of accountability that's that society has wanted, and we've begun with everybody having cameras and all those things, and I mean those things all help towards some of that. But at the end of the day, if the police are the only ones who are being held accountable, and there's no accountability that goes to the judicial system and to people being released without bonds and things like that, there's just that accountability stops at law enforcement then. So I think it's, again, really just working with your local police departments to identify if there are some issues that could lead to corruption and make sure that they're dealt with swiftly.
One of the things that we need to always keep in the back of our mind is the axiom that was coined by Lord Acton, the British nobleman. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you're going to build a power structure of a federal police, can you imagine what kind of corruption that would be in the long run with no recourse?
Well, look what we're seeing just from the FBI and the DOJ.
Yes.
I mean, they almost went after parents who protested at PTA meetings.
Yes, but the thing about the local police is there are at least 11 things that you can do to take care of local corruption or a local bad police department or an individual or something of that nature. You've got the internal affairs. You've got the chief of police. You've got the city attorney. You've got the mayor. You've got the council. Mm-hmm. You've got the county commissioners. You've got the county attorney. You've got the state attorney. You've got the legislature. I mean, all sorts of things that you can take care of these things locally.
Yeah.
You don't have to involve the federal government.
Do police chiefs and the sheriffs know this? Do they know that there is an attempt to nationalize police? Do they know where it's coming from?
Again,
or is that part of your job?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a blanket answer. I think some are more educated than others. And I think, again, as I often say, there's not a smoking gun here, right? I mean, at face value, the majority of the citizens do not want to lose their police departments, do not want to see the police defunded. But what's happening is they've taken a different approach to it. So they're doing things, the media's doing things, and some of these different government entities are doing things that are making it less desirable to be a police officer and to take on that job. So I think that's what's happening is they're weakening that system. And as with anything, as you weaken that system, sometimes people don't catch on until it's too late. So really, as a part of what we do is educating that in the brief and really highlighting some of those things that we're seeing.
Yes, sir.
The thing about what a lot of people don't realize is that you ask the question of, do the police chiefs know that there's this movement to nationalize the police? We have to remember that chiefs of police are appointed by the mayor. And as the mayor goes, so does the chief of police. So a lot of these metropolitan cities where you've got very leftist mayors, what do you think the chief of police is like? So the guy at the bottom of the rung in the police department is caught between that hierarchy that's been appointed above him. And so we have to understand that the mayors and the city attorneys in some cases are being financed by the likes of Soros.
Yeah.
And so they are anti-police. They're actually going in there to be anti-police, and they facilitate the growth of crime in their areas with the catch and release or the no bail systems and things of that nature. So what we have to make sure is that we elect people locally that are going to support the police when they're in those offices as mayors and on their city council.
Yeah, that must be tough, I'd imagine, for a police force not to have the support of the mayor. And is that...
Look at Chicago. I mean, places like that, I mean, it just must be crazy.
Well, it's even crazy now that you point it out, because it seems like the areas, the regions that need a robust, high morale police force are the ones who don't have that support, it seems. Obviously, we know what's happening in Chicago. It's running rampant. It's crazy.
Well, here again, you go back to communism and read in the manifesto that Marx said that we need to change society. And that's what they're doing in these metropolitan areas. They're upsetting society completely by the politics that they have and the policies that they have vis-a-vis the police department and how they operate.
What about training? I think, I I guess we'll use the centerpiece is this incident down in Memphis. Like those people seem deranged. Like that doesn't seem human what they did. I mean, they went at this guy for like what 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, just pummeling him. Is training is an issue. My understanding is also that the parameters or the guidelines, the standards for hiring police officers has gone down, possibly in correlation with the fact that they've been so demoralized over the last few years that it's hard to get folks on. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, I mean, I think even more so, I think the training is there. There are some standards in place of, training hours that you have to meet and those types of things. But I think you hit it on the head with the standards. So, when I started out as a police officer in early 2000s, we had recruit academy, and then we had, hours that we had to meet. We had to at least have a 2-year degree. Background checks were significant. There was people who weren't getting hired because their credit scores were too low or were lower than they wanted to see.
Okay.
So when I applied,
has that changed?
Yes. So when I applied for one of my jobs, there was 280 applicants for one position. Now that same department has probably 70 applicants for 5 positions. So we're seeing that change with less people wanting to be police officers. But then also the fact, like you said, is that now we're lowering the standards of what we're looking for, just so that we can get that, lack of a better word, warm body, to fill that spot. But what's happening now is you don't have people with the same pride and background that are enforcing the laws. And so that's where some of this is really going to start to unravel.
Yeah. I want to read something I found this morning. Like I had said, I was reading, and Jason Riley, he cited a few studies, and this paints a reality picture versus what we're here. And he said that there's a 2021 report published by the Manhattan Institute, which I have somewhere here, and I've started reading that as well. But anyway, what it shows is that police killings of black folks declined by 60 to 80% from the late 1960s to early 2000s and have remained at this level ever since. This is a 2021 report, so we don't know if... a study published in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Surgery in 2018 looked at more than 1 million service calls to police departments in Arizona, Louisiana, and North Carolina. And it found that officers use physical force in the course of arrests less than 1% of the time. And moreover, 98% of the suspects who were arrested using force sustained no or mild injury. And the last factoid is, in New York City, home of the nation's largest police department, police shootings have declined by about 90% since the early 1970s. Now, you watch the media and you listen and look at this headline here. The killing of Tyre Nichols is an indictment of the entire political system. So something's not jiving, right? Now, do our police officers and our sheriff's deputies, do they believe this? Or do they believe this? Art, you want to go first?
Well, let's back up a second and talk about the effect on a policeman who has to kill somebody. It's devastating. They are in a state of remorse forever. Of course, that remorse factor and everything starts to go down over the years. Mm-hmm. But they're put on desk duty and all sorts of things like that. My daughter quit law enforcement because they had to kill somebody. They had no choice.
Yeah.
The weapon was pointed right at them, and they already had fired it at one of the police officers and took him down and refused to put that weapon down, so they had to shoot.
Yeah.
And so things like that have a tremendous psychological effect on them, and so, nobody thinks about that. They think about that person, the family, and all of that without thinking, well, what's the effect on the policeman himself?
Well, what's the effect also of what they, especially these inner city officers, seeing day in and day out, just crime, and I would say, I don't know how to put it, like some of the worser aspects of society. I mean, these folks running around, they're rough, right? They're doing terrible things, and they're bad people. I think we can agree. you know. But anyway, back to, I guess, the same question to you, Matt, is which story do police officers believe as far as the law enforcement community, or is it a mixed batch?
No, I mean, I think they believe the facts, right?
They know the facts.
Law enforcement's really based on the facts and truths, and as Art said, I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks to themselves, I really hope I get to discharge my weapon today, or, you know, that I'm going to hurt somebody. I mean, that's just not the mentality that goes
There are no officers going out like that, you know?
None that I've come across. So,
Okay.
again, I would never say absolute with anything.
Yeah.
But point being is it becomes such a big issue. So not just for that officer, right? Let's talk Darren Wilson, right? So he was, at the end, the investigation said he did his job, he did everything right, and
That's the Michael Brown case, right?
he'll never be a police officer again. He had to.
He was charged,
He had to-
right, by Michael Brown. He was like charged at.
Yeah. He basically had to go into hiding. I mean, he lives under a false name, and his family had to, separate ties with close family members. And I mean, again, thinking big picture now, who would want to put themselves or their family through that? And so that's the other piece of what we're seeing now is you have a lot of police officers who are doing really good police work, and stop and frisk and getting drugs off the street and guns and things like that. And now there's such a pushback, based on race and number of arrests that I think a lot of officers are like, I'm just going to go do my job. I'm not going to put myself in those situations. And I think that's what's happening. That's why we're seeing crime just skyrocket in a lot of these areas, is because if they're afraid if they do something that, they're either going to lose their job, they're going to be on suspension, they're going to be in the news, their family's going to be affected.
So what do? They turn around, they pretend they don't see, they're not as aggressive, or?
I don't think they would pretend they don't see a crime. I don't think they're as aggressively pursuing those things. And those are some of the first things that these groups are going after. Now they're going after, well, what if we tell the police officers they can't make any traffic stops anymore? What if we tell them they can't stop and frisk anymore? And it's kind of like that, chipping away at that.
Yeah.
So that those crimes just continue and officers feel more and more like their hands are tied.
Another part of that is, let's say that they have a civilian police review board or something of that nature. Where they know that every action that they perform is going to be reviewed. And so they're in a situation where it's a split-second decision that they have to make. That split second may be the part where they say, now am I going to get in trouble if I do this or that? What should I do or not do? And then they're dead because they couldn't do what they wanted to do immediately, what they were trained to do, because in the back of their mind, they thought, am I going to get in trouble?
Yeah. Now, we did a story some time ago. What issue is this? In TNA, October 31st, 2022. And Bill Jasper had written about those review boards. And apparently we've had them here for a while. But anyway, Dr. Deladad, who is cited in Cleon Skouson's book, she talks about them. And she says they were a communist idea. And the idea was to somehow get the police out from under the control of elected officials and subject the police to the discipline of a civilian group which the party could infiltrate and control.
She was on the National Committee of the Communist Party.
Yes. And so is that saying that you get them under these police review boards and then you either infiltrate them or they're already full of activists? Is that the idea?
Well, they always appoint the activists. That's the problem. And even if you have one or two people on there that are pro-police, they're overwhelmed by the others.
Is that how they've worked?
Always.
Have you had any experience? Do you know anything about these police review boards?
I mean, we had police and fire commissions in all the departments that I worked at. Again, we're talking smaller town Wisconsin versus New York, LA, some of those. So I definitely, would say there's significant differences. But I do think, again, Art was right. It's now those things are coming into officers' heads, that the back of their minds is, I don't want to end up on the news. I don't want to, and those are going through their mind as they're having to make some of those life and death decisions. And I think, unfortunately, that's where we're seeing some of this hesitation, and it's getting some police officers hurt. It's getting their partners injured in some cases. So, and again, at the end of the day, there's this review board who may or may not understand what it's like to be in that situation. One of the greatest things I think some of the local departments did was they had some journalists come in and put a gun on the side and run them through some scenarios to see what that is like to make that kind of decision. Because it's really easy to on a Monday morning sit back and with your cup of coffee and say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that, until you're in that situation.
One of the crazy, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like one of the craziest ideas that I hear is that we need counselors instead of police officers come in. It seems like to the scene of a crime. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Obviously, did you want to elaborate on that?
Not particularly. I mean,
isn't that?
It's so inane, it just beyond discussion.
I can't tell if they're serious. Yeah, sometimes I wonder if they put something out there just to test to see how moronic people are. And the thing is, I have talked to some rather seemingly intelligent folks about these, and then they're serious. They think that, when you have a call, I used to cover courts and cops back in Montana when I was a journalist, and most of the domestic or the domestic violence calls, I think almost 98% of them had meth or alcohol involved.
Sure.
It's like, these are not going to be rational people when you get there. No. I mean, does that sound accurate?
Again, I think the thought behind it was maybe
well-meaning, but maybe a little fantastical.
Yeah, I think so. If you look at it on paper, these emergency commitments or dealing with people who have mental health issues are just taking up an absorbent amount of resources and time of the police officers.
Right.
So the thought was, if we have a specialist in this field, but again, it goes back to accountability. So now you're asking the police officer to be accountable, and you're asking this person to be accountable. But when you take them to the hospital and they get turned over to your, social service department, they're so overwhelmed that they're not giving them the treatment they need. And so they're out the door 2 days later. And so did it really help on this end? Well, maybe it kept from having to use deadly force in a bad situation, maybe in some cases. But again, where's the follow through on the rest of it? Everybody's short-staffed, and that person just gets put back on the streets.
Well,
another part of that is this: criminals don't think like normal people. These remedies are sold to normal people as if they are pretty good. A normal person says, "Yeah, that'll work on but they don't work on criminals. On the criminal mind, they just don't work.
Yeah, but you would think that a normal person, a normal rational person, would be able to observe and say, okay, this doesn't make any sense. Again, maybe they've never read a police report. They've never seen a court document. I mean, most of these folks, they're not thinking rationally. Most of them are on drugs. From what I've seen, the region that I've covered out north central Montana, and I'd imagine that's a reflection of a lot of places around here. And like you had mentioned, mental health. Mental health is huge. I think we can all agree that there's a great, I don't know what the percentage is, but there's probably a good chance that more than half of the people in prisons as well as in jails have some sort of mental health deficiencies and problems. And so I think there's some truth to that. I like to always make sure that we take a nuanced look. And obviously this problem or seemingly problem has a lot of moving parts in it. I wanted to talk about...
Well, let me say this. Back in the day, before we got into this touchy-feely stuff,
tell us, Art.
we could handle law and order a lot better than what we do today. Let's put it that way.
What do you mean?
We didn't try and psychoanalyze all this stuff.
Yeah.
We just, this is the law, you obey it, and when you don't, you go to jail. It's just that simple.
Like, that was your job as a police officer. Is it like, are you keeping the peace? Yeah. Are they violating? If not, what do I do? What's the next step? Do I arrest them, subdue them, whatever? And that's it. We don't sit there and bring the counselor in and have a session.
Yeah.
Watch out for that right hook. It's like, okay, now that's, I mean, but that's a That's a cultural problem. Everything is psycho. Everything, every touchy-feely. You're right, absolutely. I mean, that's a good old word.
One of the problems that we're dealing with is a general deterioration of morality across the board in the general population. And along with that is responsibility. And as people don't assume the responsibility for their own actions and for their families and et cetera, crime is going to go up.
Yeah.
It's that simple. And so we have to, and that's why it's disturbing to see an attack on religion across the country.
Yeah.
Religion teaches morality, and kids, when they grow up in that atmosphere, then they grow up to be better citizens. It's just that simple.
Yeah, it is that simple. I absolutely agree. Let's talk about the benefits of having a local police, especially that of protecting local citizens from the usurpations and the violations of power toward those citizens.
It's all about the type of service you're going to receive.
Yeah.
So if you work in a community where that police officer lives, or numerous police officers live, which I did, and I had a take-home squad car. I mean, I had people come to my door at all hours of the day, and you know, and
That
again,
doesn't sound fun.
well, again,
dinner?
right? Yeah. But on the flip side of it, that was trust, right? I mean, I had earned the trust of the citizens that they were comfortable to come to me. So that's what I feel like you get in a smaller town, and you can solve some of those issues, I think, quicker than, you know, even in this case, even if the county comes in, you know, they're stretched. They have one deputy who might be working over, you know, 10 square mile area. And so that deputy might be going from call to call. They can't spend that time to really get to the root of what the issue was and how can we, you know, move on, or, you know, how can we remedy that issue?
Yeah.
And that's really what local departments are providing. You know, they're going to do national night out things. They're going to do community events. They're going to be, you know, involved in giving back to the community.
Yeah.
And again, in this case, the county is still doing that here too. It's just on a different level when you start talking about all these smaller areas in some of these, you know, cities that that have their own police department.
Yeah, I guess what I wanted to kind of discuss was the police forces, especially sheriffs, it seems like, have a duty to, for instance, nullify unconstitutional edicts and things like that.
Well, the sheriff is the top dog, so to speak, in the county.
Is he? Because apparently he's not. They're freaking out. We got this rise of constitutional sheriffs across the country, and they're freaking out.
Well, they're actually assuming their responsibility. Most people don't realize that the sheriff, in some counties, it's the coroner, but those are very, very few.
In some counties, the sheriff is the coroner.
Well, that could be, but at any rate,
does that sound right, Matt? Because I've met a couple of sheriffs. They were also the coroner. I was like, oh, I didn't know you did that. Or the undersheriff. It's the undersheriff or the sheriff. They're the coroner.
I've never run into that, but at any rate, under our system of government, with the powers that are supposed to be local. The sheriff is the man who is the top law enforcement officer, and he can nullify an awful lot. He can tell the federal government to go take a leap if they come in unconstitutionally to do something. And by that, I mean, you know, the FBI, any number of law enforcement organizations from the federal government have been prevented from doing certain things because of these constitutionally minded sheriffs.
Yeah, that movement seems to be growing. Of course, I think we all know Sheriff Mack. He gets a lot of crap from the media. I met him. Very nice guy, by the way.
What's going on is these sheriffs that are growing because they're learning what the law really states. The primary law, the Constitution, the state constitution, the county charter, that sort of thing. And they know that law instead of all these regulations on regulations on regulations.
Yeah.
Which are a lot of them in complete violation of that basic law.
Yeah. I want to tell a story and then segue into the last section, and which is what action you guys recommend. So when I was living out, before moving to Wisconsin, I was during COVID. When COVID started, I was living out in the county in Montana, and they had all the craziness with the masks that they had everywhere else. And, you know, you had the mask Nazis, and then you had the health department trying to implement and enforce their edicts and whatnot. But the county sheriff thanks to citizens a lot of them who are actually, some of them who are Birchers or at least supporters, they met with the county sheriff and they said, look, you not only do not have to enforce these edicts, which are not laws, but you're actually required to protect us from those. And that my county sheriff was one of, I believe, 55 or 54 in that state that signed onto a press release saying basically, we're not the mass police. Furthermore, we have a lot of important things to do as deputies and even as the police officers. Like there's actual crime, we have to check that out. And so there was no teeth behind those edicts. And, I walked around, I went to the grocery store without mask, and one of the bars never closed, even though they got a lot of crap from the local paper, and the health department kept, whatever. Nothing ever happened to them. And I think part of that was that there was no force. There was no teeth, because the sheriff already said, it's like, that's not what we're here to do. Is that the power of an informed law enforcement?
Absolutely. And the thing about trying to force the police or the sheriff or anything else to enforce these edicts, which a lot of people know are simply edicts, not law.
Yeah.
It creates a gulf between the population and law enforcement. How dare you tell me to do this when you should know what the law is, and I know what the law is.
Yeah. And the sheriffs need to step in. The sheriffs and the police departments, they need to step in to make sure our constituency. That's part. It's not just protecting them from someone coming at them with a baton or kicking them or whatever. It's it's bigger than that, right, Matt?
Yeah, and I think this was one of those few times in history where it really came down to there was a lot of political activity that influenced some of those sheriffs. I think a lot of them were thinking re-election and what are some of these citizens thinking about, some that we should be enforcing these, kind of the other side of it, So
that pressure wouldn't have happened if they weren't local, right?
Right.
If they weren't locally controlled.
Yeah. So if learning again making sure you understand what the Constitution says and what your job as a sheriff is, and understanding that the other part of that is, yes, it's a political position, but that doesn't come first. The citizens and the Constitution comes first.
All right, let's finish it off with this. What do we recommend? We have JBS recommendations. We have larger recommendations. Art, we'll start with you.
Well, I recommend that the people organize Support Your Local Police Committees in their area. They can go to John Birch Society website, jbs.org, and find out what materials are available. They can contact the staff of the John Birch Society in their area and formulate the committees. But that's the easy part, okay?
Well, is it? Because you were part of an SYOP committee. Was it easy?
Two of them. Two very successful committees, I might add, because we had good people who were willing to do some work.
Yeah.
And not complain, but actually do things. And so...
not like us millennials.
But the thing is that you have to build community support for what's going on. You have to educate the community. That's step number one. And the other is that you have to educate law enforcement themselves. Yeah. You have to meet with the chief of police and the sheriff and others to make sure that they understand these things. The newsletter that you put out, twice a year is built around informing law enforcement about the background of an intelligence, but also the background of what the law is. And so we have to educate both and work with both. And then that includes the police unions, not just the chief of police and that sort of thing, because a lot of times the police unions are more square on what the needs are in the local departments. So support your local police committees are where it's at.
Okay. And we have, like you said, the jbs.org. If you go on their action projects, we have a Support Your Local Police tab there, and you go in there. We have manuals on how to create ad hoc committees. And, of course, we have informational resources. What about you, Matt? What do you got? What do you do?
I think, again, I use the word accountability a lot, but I think that we as citizens have to be accountable too, and we have to say that we can't just stand by and let a lot of this go on. We have to get involved. So get educated, get yourself on a local board, get yourself on a police and fire commission. Work with legislature to start talking about things we can do to make sure that police officers are supported, that are, make that job something that is sought after again, so that we're getting the right kind of people, educated, good people that are out there protecting the citizens. So I think, as Art said, support your local police, and really just knowing that we need each and every person to get involved and to be educated, because the noisy few get the headlines, right?
Yeah,
that's what we see.
Squeaky,
right?
was it the
squeaky wheel? Yep.
The squeaky wheel makes the noise. I don't know,
the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but
yes.
There
you go. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, that's what's happening. Is
still finishing my coffee.
is we're seeing that on such a big. This is what we see now, and it doesn't. As you talked about, millions of interactions are happening every day with law enforcement where there's no issues and things are being solved.
An overwhelming majority of them. The numbers don't lie.
Right.
We need law and order in this country, but we also need justice. Without the two, we don't have an orderly society.
Well, that's a good point, because some may watch this and they're like, well, what about justice? It's like, we're not against justice. We're not. Those police officers, if they're as guilty as they look, they should come. They should meet justice. They should come at the crossroads, and they should get the appropriate consequences and repercussions.
Hitler gave the Germans a lot of law and order. So you do need that justice part.
Yeah.
And there's no police officer that I've ever talked to that wouldn't agree that, if some other police officer is committing a crime or has done something that's heinous or against the law, it needs to be dealt with, and they need to be held accountable. Because again, it just weakens the system if you don't believe that. So I think that every officer, good police officer is the same way. Like, let's get the bad ones out.
And that's the majority of them. That seems, again, that's what the facts bear out. And also, people need to realize, and that's kind of the crux of what we're discussing here, is that if we let the police credibility deteriorate, and for whatever reason, we lose our minds and we say, okay, we'll put them under control of activists and the central government, which apparently can't do anything right in the first place. We lose the protections, and we lose liberty, right? I mean, it's no coincidence, like I started out, that all these totalitarian states, they have to have a monopoly on force, because you can't send the army in if all the police and the county and the sheriffs or whatever, they're like, no, you're not coming in, we're protecting you. And all of a sudden, they're the leaders. They would become the leaders of the constituency and say, it's like, no, we're not going to deal with that. A totally different game. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your time. Thank you for all you do. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. So in this day of fact-free moral panic, it's crucial that we help create understanding about why it's so important to keep our police local and independent. Our liberty depends on it. Please check out our Support Your Local Police Action campaign at jbs.org for information and action materials right under Action Projects. And if you haven't joined the John Birch Society in our epic undertaking to restore America, consider applying for membership. We are looking for good members. Check out the link in the description below. So in the meantime, don't forget that whatever the societal ailment, freedom is always the cure.